All right, so reading comp section of the LSAT. Basic little intro here. Both of y'all know this, but I'm sure plenty of people watching the video don't. RC counts for one of the three scored sections, right? There are two scored LR, one scored RC on the LSAT. An RC section has four passages. Recently, it's almost always been 27 questions. They seem to have been very standardized now around that number. Individual passages can range from 5 to 8 questions in length. And the text can range from like a little over 1 page to 2.5 pages in length. Just like LR sections, on average, the first passage is the easiest passage, and the third passage is the most difficult. Passage types. When we think about passage types, there's a couple of ways to sort things. So let's start with the biggest one, which is on the modern test, 3 passages are what we would call standard. There is one author or like a group authorship, but it's one document, right? In contrast, one passage will be a comparative passage in which you get 2 short essays that are related to each other in some clear way, but the relationship can differ greatly. You can have 2 combative authors that are on opposing sides. You can have 2 authors that are making gestures towards compromise towards each other. We've had ones involving like a news article about a shipwreck and, raising the shipwreck, and a statute about underwater cultural heritage and required methods for protecting it, right? There's a lot of different ways comparatives can work, or the relationship between the 2 passages in a comparative works. And we'll take a look at one later called evolutionary psychology that was on my actual exam, the 179 I got, PT64. We'll also take a look at a really nice science-based one from PT63 called ocean floor geological changes. Second, we can slice by topic. I don't like slicing by topic because I don't think that really gives a lot of visibility. Some people are much more confident with certain topics than others. But every passage on the RC section is self-contained. You do not need any exterior knowledge or familiarity with the topic, at least in theory, to understand what's going on in the passage and be able to answer the questions. So these 4 topics tend to represent people's comfort level with certain broad ideas. Some people have a humanities or social sciences background and then hate regular science ones. Science people tend to not have fun with law passages. But that is a handicap that can be easily overcome with a little bit of reading and practice. My bigger thing, and one we'll talk about greatly today, is frameworks. Frameworks are a method of understanding what the author is functionally attempting to do within a passage. And LSAT Lab, the test prep vendor that I prefer, divides passages into 7 broad frameworks, and we will talk extensively about those. In terms of question types, the biggest thing I want to point out to people always is that this is not a test about content. If we look at these questions, big picture, author intent, detail questions, ones where we actually have to pull a factual detail from the passage, implied questions, inferential questions, and then beyond passage questions. So if you think of the SAT, it's mainly just this, right? This is what the SAT is about. It's about, can you read this and at least understand the content that's being put down? The LSAT is barely concerned with that because you're going to law school, you should 100,000% be able to pick up the content being put down. Instead, the big question on the LSAT is, can you understand what authors are doing and how essays are structured to achieve outcomes, right? That is the true meat of the questions on this section. And from working with hundreds of students at this point, I can say that everybody gets great at these early, this is the grouping of questions, these inferential based ones. That's what people struggle with all the way up until the end. So that gives you a little bit of an overview on kind of what we're doing question-wise. I've got a few passages teed up for later, so we'll talk a lot about individual question types and approaches at that point. But yeah, this is our big groupings, and basically all of them involve inferential or author attitude ideas. Cool. Let me tap back over. So let's talk about the difficulty gradient on the reading comp section, like from an abstract perspective. So there's really three big issues that we have to cope with in order to excel on the section. So first and foremost, we have to read and comprehend what's happening in the passage. Some of these passages are very academic and abstract, and that can be quite difficult sometimes. So we have to build reading and comprehension strategies for when we run into those types of passages. Second, memory, right? We are reading a long passage and answering questions very quickly, and that can be very trying on the memory. As we work through questions, there are very well-designed answer choice traps that are intended to play off of the fallibility of our memory. So, finding a way to improve our retention of what we read is also wildly important. And then finally, it's just time pressure alone, right? Again, I'll emphasize we're reading 6 to 8 pages, I would say, of text, and then answering 27 questions in 35 minutes. So if you take 4 minutes to read each passage, well, now you only have 19 minutes to answer 27 questions, right? So we literally have to do questions in 45 seconds-ish if we want to keep up with the pace of the section. So let's think about how we spend that time, right? Well, actually, let me walk through a couple of the additional ideas here. These passages are often intentionally poorly written. The LSAT will ask authors of real academic texts if they can use parts of those texts as passages. And then the LSAT will rewrite those in small ways to make them much, much harder to understand and use, right? This is, again, part of the built-in difficulty. One of the big things you'll start to notice as you practice reading comp more and more is that listing words are very absent, right? Structural words, the sort of things a good author uses to help their reader understand the content, those are all stripped out and replaced with much weaker versions. And we're going to see a really great example of hidden lists today. We also have very different authors. Some of our authors are very educational and hands-off. They're just there to teach us about something they find fascinating. We also have authors that are highly confrontational and argumentative. They want to persuade us that they are right and somebody else is wrong, right? And sometimes they're in between, which is honestly the most difficult type of author to deal with. The one that has a light touch, that does have a side, but isn't signaling their hand very heavily. That is the type of author that is painful to deal with when we think about these author intent and author opinion and inference questions. So we run the gamut of authors, and we have to be able to adapt and respond to each passage accordingly. So let's think about time economics in 5 categories, or 4 categories, sorry. The first is our initial read and any memory retention aids we use during the initial read. I am a note taker, and we'll look at my note-taking approach later. But you really have to factor that in, right? Not using memory retention aids, as we'll talk about in a little bit, can be disastrous. But using memory retention aids ineffectively is also potentially disastrous. So a lot of this is training yourself to do things the right way under time pressure. Second part is question stem analysis. question stems in reading comp tend to be more complex and contain more info than in logical reasoning. If you approach this section with a logical reasoning mindset, you'll often skip past key info that's in the question stem itself. So we have to pause and breathe when we're reading stems and think about what are they already spotting me? Where are they directing me to? Third is obviously answer choice analysis. That kind of goes without saying. And the fourth, and the most disastrous one for students, is reread time. So from my perspective, most new students fall into a very dangerous trap. They keep focusing on minimizing their initial read time. The problem with doing that is if you don't come out of the initial read with a good understanding of the passage or a good memory of where things are in it, all you're doing is delaying that time spent. You're not actually reducing the amount of time you spend reading, you're just pushing it into reread time. And reread time is not nearly as effective. So I want all of you, anybody who watches this video, to keep that in mind. Pay attention to how much time you spend rereading and ask if you would be better served spending more time up front and using an effective memory retention aid. All right. So I always like to point out, I as a professional who does this, and with a 179, often take as long on my initial reading as a mid 160 student does. I just use that time much more effectively than they do. And as a result, I fly through questions where they struggle and have to reread. So learn a good memory retention strategy. It will massively, massively improve the time usage, which, as we've already emphasized, is the hardest part of the reading comprehension section. All right, so let's think about the economics of memory retention and the ways we can help. So very few people can just effortlessly retain information they read, right? Even I can't do that. I do note-taking for a very specific reason, which is I think it really does help me. And when I was an attorney, any meeting you saw me in, I would be taking notes because I thought it would really help me. And it's a good, protective strategy against people fucking you over. Just for reference, law firms are political, people are competitive, and some of them are not great people. Take handwritten notes of anyone you ever meet with. Anyone you ever meet with. It's hard to get fucked over when you have contemporaneous handwritten notes. Just a forewarning for your careers if you go into big law. All right, so 3 big memory retention aids we can use on the LSAT. The first is note-taking. Second is highlighting. The third is word searching. For you, any of you that don't know, the LSAT does in fact have a search text bar. I know this is the LSAT lab one, but if you go onto Law Hub, you will also find that there is one of these installed. You are allowed to use this search text feature when you're taking the section. And it is quite useful when used well, and we're going to talk pretty extensively about what that means to use it well. So let's just start with note-taking, because I really do pitch this hard because I genuinely believe in it. Learning and psych research has repeatedly found over and over that nothing is better than handwritten note-taking for maximizing comprehension and short-term retention of written information. When it comes to comprehension, researchers have really observed that when people take notes on computers, it ends up being like stream of consciousness. They transcribe each and every word, or basically every word they hear. The problem with that is if you're doing that, you're not really thinking about the words. You're just typing them back down, right? On the other hand, when you take notes by hand, you cannot transmit verbatim or transcript verbatim everything that is said. You have to think about what's important. You have to decide which parts are worth capturing and which parts aren't worth capturing. And that creates a lot better comprehension, including of the things you don't even include, right? Because you had to think about them and determine whether they were worth including. When it comes to retention, it's the same thing. Handwritten notes while reading something is just such a better amount of retention than anything else. Better than active reading, better than powerful highlighting, better than active questioning and engagement, reading engagement strategies. There just isn't anything better than writing stuff down by hand. Genuinely isn't. So, from the perspective of the LSAT, we should maybe take these researchers' findings into account and try to use note-taking as effectively as possible. Let's keep going. So let's talk about a few ideas, and here we're going to talk about highlighters a lot. Number one, a lot of students engage in passive reading. And if you're doing nothing but reading a text, no plan, no intent behind what you're doing, no method, then you're passive reading. And passive reading is near pointless. You come out with a foggy grasp of the information in it, and you come out with a very foggy grasp of what the author's goals and intentions were, because you're not really asking those things as you read. You're not trying to think about those things as you read. Don't be a passive reader. You're not going to do well on the RC section as a passive reader. Even like the people who don't do note-taking or highlighting but do well, they're almost always engaging in an active questioning strategy. One of my best students works along those methods. He does a full read, and then he goes back up at the top and walks back through the paragraphs quickly, asking himself some key questions about what the content is and what it seems like the author is trying to accomplish. And that really works for him. So if you're not going to do note-taking, you really need to be doing active questioning. It is undoubtedly the 1A, 1B strategies. So if we think about active questioning in the LSAT context, we really want to be actively questioning the author's goals. So things like, why did the author write this? i.e., what is the purpose of this? Are they approaching it from a teaching or persuading perspective? That tells us a lot about attitude. What substantive point are they trying to make? Well, that should theoretically be the answer to the main point question that's attached to basically every passage. We have things like, how strongly does the author stake a position? Because that's really important when we're making inferences about what the author would believe of X, Y, Z hypothetical fact. Same thing with how intensely do they stake their position? Are they deeply involved or have a light touch? That matters a lot for the tone of correct inference answers. A lot of inference questions and inference answer type questions will have substantively basically what the author is saying, but it will involve a much harsher attitude or tone than the author engages in. And so if we don't pay attention to that, we're going to get those questions wrong. We also need to ask, like, where in the text is the author's voice coming through versus which parts of the text are factual background, i.e. detail-oriented questions we may need to answer, and which part of the text communicate other people's perspectives, and that would be like non-author opinion questions. So you can see how each of these active questioning strategies, each of these questions, really does help relate back to actual question types, right? So if you're going to engage in active questioning, do it in a way that really corresponds to what the test is looking for. Highlighters. I really, really, really like highlighters when used tactically. Highlighters are often nothing but a passive engagement strategy. It's barely better than passive reading. So first, right, it tends to come from this attitude of, that seems important, I'm going to highlight this whole sentence. That's not engaging with the sentence. That's not asking why it would be important. That's not asking what role the sentence plays in the author's overall approach. That's just passively going, oh, that seems important. I'll highlight it. That's nothing. That's not real comprehension or engagement with the text. Number two, over highlighting can make you blind to the information that isn't highlighted. I have seen students reread a paragraph 4 times and fail to see an answer that is just blatantly spelled out in that paragraph. And the reason is because the detail they're looking for was in a non-highlighted sentence, and it was buried between 2 highlighted sentences. And so they became blind, right? I watched them for 2.5 minutes reread that paragraph and not see the answer, which was plain as day. Don't be that person, okay? Do not create a situation in which you totally fail to read the text because you've highlighted so much of the text. So, final point is this. You do not know what info will be critical to answering questions. You do not know. We can make approximations and guesses, but highlighting seems to be based on the idea that we can predict what's going to come up. And we can't. So passive highlighting is very, very bad approach to this exam. So when do we use highlighters? Well, highlighters are great for tagging where the author has made examples. So for instance, that's the sort of thing I would highlight while reading. I would also highlight listing words, moreover, and finally. Really, really good to call out where there's hidden lists in the author's text because that helps structure our understanding, which also makes it easier to remember the actual content. And finally, there are a lot of one-word instances of author opinion. So a wonderful tool. If an author says that, it's pretty clear they have a very positive opinion of the tool. They didn't go about it at length, but capturing that word, that subtle instance of author opinion can be really powerful. So that's good usage of highlighters. You find tactical, specific things that you want to highlight, never full sentences. You are giving yourself a visual map of the passage when you use a highlighter. All right, so handwritten note-taking, we'll talk about it in a sec. Also talk about tools for information retrieval, and we'll also talk about that, and we'll talk about narrative frameworks. So I want to jump into a passage, one of my favorite ones, and I just want to walk through what's happening in this passage and what's most important to pull out of it. So this is Stealing Thunder is the short name for this passage. It's from Prep Test 74, Section 3, Passage 2. And I think that would make it in Prep Test 141 in the new numbering system. So I just want to walk through a very standard sort of law passage that is, oddly enough, a highlight noteworthy passage. So when I say highlight noteworthy passage, that sort of passage focuses on people, schools of thought, and they are non-argumentative educational passages, right? You might read a passage about, it wouldn't surprise me, for example, if they have one about Jane Goodall in the next 6 months, now that she's passed away. It wouldn't surprise me at all if they either got permission to use something from one of her works or like a highlight noteworthy about her in particular. These passages are not trying to prove things to us, really. They're just trying to educate us on something the author finds fascinating. So let's go into this passage with that in mind. And I'll kind of indicate why that matters so much. So first, we have what I would call a very standard introductory paragraph. This is actually a well-written paragraph for once. Stealing thunder is a courtroom strategy that consists in a lawyer's revealing negative information about a client before it's revealed or elicited by an opposing lawyer. So the author instantly identified the topic, stealing thunder, and instantly defined it for us. That's what a good author does in their intro. They tell us the topic and they start explaining what it means. Our author continues that while there is no point in revealing a weakness that is unknown to one's opponents, or that men would not be exploited, many lawyers believe that if the weakness is likely to be revealed, it should be volunteered. Otherwise, the hostile revelation would be more damaging. So, the author gave us the topic, defined what it meant, and explained why we should care, right? Explained the real world implications of this idea. That's genuinely a good introductory paragraph. So, we can already see how this might fit the idea of a highlight noteworthy. The author doesn't seem to be getting combative or persuasive in any way. They seem to just want to explain this thing to us. Keep going. One of the big things that shows up in Reading Comp that doesn't show up as much in LR just because of the shortness of the LR format is hedges and limitations. Hedges and limitations are critical when you're a litigator, right? You need to cabin your conclusions. You need to express uncertainty to some degree, right? You need to seem reasonable. And reasonable authors address the weaknesses of their positions or the lack of evidence in their cases. They don't try to just gloss over it and hope the judge never notices. I mean, I guess if you're in state court, you can do that. But in federal court, that's... Well, back when I was practicing, you wouldn't want to try that in federal court. But obviously, the quality of federal court judges has been dropping a lot lately. So maybe you could get away with it now in federal court, too. Still wouldn't suggest trying to. But being able to cabin your stuff correctly and build credibility through that process is really, really important in establishing trust with the judge or the jury. So, our author immediately starts this paragraph like a good academic would by calling out the limitations of their own info. No empirical research has directly tested the effectiveness of stealing thunder in actual trials. I'll just go ahead and say that's a given because for anybody to test this, they would probably be breaching their fiduciary duties to their clients, right? If a lawyer thinks that they should do this in a specific situation, they're not allowed to not do so because they want to experiment, right? That would be breaching your duties to your client. Best representation possible. Anyways, our author continues by telling us that studies involving simulated situations have suggested that it is, in fact, effective. Okay, so they drew a limitation on the depth of the research they have, but immediately told us that the research they do have indicates this does work. So let's see the type of evidence. Lawyers' commonly held belief is not only corroborated by these experimental trial situations, it is also supported by several psychological explanations. So here's where we get to that idea of, in the original document, there is no way the list was constructed like this. This carries every bit of evidence of LSAT, of the LSAC changing this to make it harder to see. This should be a first, second, third. This would be a massively improved passage in terms of readability if this just said, first, volunteering damage early may create an image of credibility. Second, stealing thunder provides juries with an impetus for critical assessment of opposing testimony. Finally, the value placed on a message is probably like the value placed on any commodity. Right? That would be very direct and obvious that the author is giving us a 1, 2, 3 list. But instead, the LSAT makes this very hard to see. One thing may also. I would say the majority of students that I've done this passage with miss the hidden list the first time around, right? But obviously, once you structure the list like this, becomes a lot easier to remember the 3 reasons. That's why we do lists at all. It helps structure our memory. So always be looking for hidden lists. this gigantic paragraph becomes way more digestible when you realize that it's a 1, 2, 3 list. So we'll pause there and pop open to my older reading comprehension document. Okay. Come on, you can load. Oh, good Lord. Okay. All right. So here are two versions of the same notes. These, I think, were taken about 5 months apart. I like to do this on a regular basis where I do notes again for a passage while I'm working on it with a student without looking at my old ones. So this one obviously has a bit more detail on the right-hand side, trying to explain what each note is capturing. So you saw when we talked about the first paragraph, I was like, this is a really great introduction. And the reason was that it's doing the exact things an introduction is built to do. It gives us the topic, it defines the core term, and it tells us why this topic is worth caring about. In the second, I immediately call out the limitations. And then I also call out that there's a 1, 2, 3 list. And you can see that when I'm taking those notes from the list, I'm trying to capture the causative idea, right? Admitting to a weakness creates an image of credibility, which makes me more persuasive down the road. I help make the jury more resistant to the way the opposition wants to frame things. And finally, by making the fact less scarce, I turn it into old news, which makes it less persuasive. You can see that my earlier notes, remarkably similar, right? That is the thing. Once you develop a good note-taking strategy, you'll start to find that you're wildly consistent. You know exactly what you're looking for each time, and you know what you want to grab. You can tell that this was done in a more of a live test situation because I was typing much faster and using a lot more short words before equals, arrow, 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 etc. When you develop a note-taking style, you should develop a shorthand as well. Part of being efficient with note-taking is developing a powerful, useful shorthand. Let's jump back over. We'll look at the last paragraph here. So our author actually ends up continuing this list, which is a little odd, and tells us that finally it can work because we can frame it in our own terms and we can use this word spin, right? That's what this little term that comes in. Anytime you see a term in a passage that has quotation marks around it, like spin or old news, there is a decent chance that that gets tested as what we would call a local purpose or local usage question, where we are asked, why did the author use that term? Or what did the author mean with that term given the context around it? So I do like to often highlight words like this, just to call out where are these little author terms being added in. So finally, we end this passage with another limitation, right? This is a very academic author. And so they are again calling out the limits of what they know and don't know. And here the author says, yeah, this may only be good if we can frame things positively. If it's really negative, right? If there's no way to really frame it positively, then maybe we should wait for the opposing side to bring it up, because if we bring it up, we're just instantly making people not listen to us at all. So, theme example, law passage, with a highlight noteworthy, like, overlapping element here. All right, I'll pause for a half second. Anybody got any questions so far, thoughts, concerns, things that came up as we were talking? You can turn on your mic or put it in the chat bar. It's whatever you want to do. Okay. All right. So this is, I would say, a pretty standard but moderately difficult passage. We have a mix of well-written segments, like the first and last paragraph, I would say, are fairly well written. And then we have a mix of deceptive, intentionally poor writing, which is a mega paragraph that contains a very hidden list. Um, so we'll mm, go ahead and pause. Anyone who wants to reread this is more than welcome to. Okay, those highlights I will leave. So we'll take a minute. People can reread, and then we'll jump into our first set of questions before getting back to some more like abstract skill building stuff. So I'll scroll in about 45 seconds or so. And maybe like 15 more seconds, and we'll jump in. All right, main point questions. So we'll start talking about question type approaches from like a broad perspective here, and then get into the nitty-gritty on some of the questions that involve that. So we're going to talk about frameworks in a minute. And the reason we're going to talk about frameworks is because frameworks also tell us how a main point answer should be structured. For example, an old-new passage, we're going to see one today, is about the transition between an old theory, very common in science passages, to a new theory, right? Old, new. And when you get a main point question on an old, new passage, you want it to mention the old and the new, right? You want it to be focused on that changeover and the reasons for why it happened. Here, we've got what I would say is pretty core highlight noteworthy idea. So we're looking for something that talks about stealing thunder and highlights the things our author has told us about it, which is, broadly speaking, it seems fairly well supported by both simulations and psychology research, but there are limitations on what we know and how to use it. So I'm just keeping that in mind. So I go over here and I think about that. And I also think about scope. Main point answers should theoretically encompass either the conclusion or really the entirety of the passage. Often you will run into answer choices that are the main point of a single paragraph as opposed to the entirety of it, right? And so we have to really be thinking about scope. Is this big enough to cover the whole passage, but not so big that we go outside the bounds of what the author discussed? So one strategy I'll just explain very briefly, because we're going to be doing it a fair bit today, is to go from E up rather than A down. I know this sounds random to a lot of people, but I really want you to keep in mind that this is an actively deceitful, trap-filled exam. They are not testing just your knowledge or your ability to read. They are testing your ability to think clearly, right? To sidestep intensely, intensely tempting bad answers. Wrong answers are intensely designed, right? The question makers really think about what sort of wrong answers are likely to induce bad decision making from students. So, with all of that said, they assume that you will read from A to E and not from E to A. And thus, by going from E to A, you avoid answer choice traps that are built on the order of the answer choices. Also, native English speakers have a built-in tendency to read left to right and top to bottom, which means when you are reading an answer choice A, once you finish A, your brain and your eyes automatically start to drift towards the start of the next answer. And you might find, if you pay attention, that that causes a little bit of disorientation and momentary confusion when you try to snap back to just think about A. Reading from E up eliminates that, right? You are no longer reading downwards into something new. Even if I'm reading D, I'm reading downwards into an answer choice I already looked at, and I'll know to stop very quickly, as opposed to my brain going on autopilot and just reading all 5 answers without really considering any of them. So, E. Research has confirmed the usefulness. Research designed to confirm the usefulness has vindicated lawyers' belief and has identified the general limitations. That doesn't feel right, right? That's a little too strong. It's a little too intense for the author's tone. And this word identify the limitations also suggests limitations. That's a little bit different intensity and certainty level. I also think about this designed to confirm, and the only research I think that was designed to confirm this was the simulated trial situations. All of the other research we had was more broadly psych research that is applicable to the situation, as opposed to specific psychological studies done on people in this situation. So E feels goodish, but it's going too intensely in tone. D, the risk can outweigh the probable benefits. That's the last paragraph. That's only the limitation brought up in the last paragraph. This is the sort of trap answer for people who always assume the last thing being said is the conclusion of the entire essay, right? And you'd be surprised at how many people fall into that default, right? Because in most things we read, it's kind of true. But the LSAT doesn't make it easy like that. So never assume that where the author ends the passage is the main point of the passage. It can be, but it usually isn't. Gita said C, and I think Gita's right. C feels small, right? But it is 100% accurate. There is nothing incorrect about what is said in C, right? And it broadly captures what the author's trying to do, which is explain the basis for thinking this works, which is almost entirely psychological research based. Oh, excuse me, I just need to change how I'm saying. B, again, too small, right? This again feels like D, where it's just kind of talking about this downside and the risk of it. And A is the trap answer here. Why is it a trap? Does anyone want to volunteer something in chat? What makes it such an effective trap?
It includes the limitations that are also talked about, but then it says that it's using actual trials and research, but we know that that there isn't actual research or trials, but rather like um some psychological things that lead us to believe that. I didn't explain that well, but
Exactly. No, you're 100% on point, though. 100%. Yeah, A is misstating what's actually said in the passage. The concept about stealing thunder, that it seems effective, but there are limits, they're using all of that to hide the fact that this is not what the author said. It is not actual trials, period, end stop. And so even though C feels smaller than A, again, C is not actually saying anything that is actively incorrect, and A is saying something that's actively incorrect. So if I remember, this might be the hardest question on this passage. It's a really tough main point. But that gets across the idea of these are really well-designed traps. Really, really well-designed traps, right? Too strong, design slash vindicated, too contradicted actual trials. Both A and E sound better than C from a broadness perspective. They cover the limitations as well as the support. But then they add one major flaw to each of these answers, and suddenly C is the best one remaining. So, good start to the reading comprehension section, I would say. All right, so now we have what we would call just an application question, right? Which of these is a good example of stealing thunder? We want to pause in a question like this because they gave us a very clear definition of what stealing thunder is. So we, since we know that that clear definition is up here and why they would do this, we should just do a quick little refresh. And I see, okay, reveal negative info before it could be revealed by an opposing lawyer. And we do this because we think it would be bad for us when the opposing side brings it up. And so we bring it up ourselves to help diffuse it, right? So I look at something like E. I'm not defending the client. Like at this point, I'm throwing my client on the mercy of the court, which may be a great decision given the client's case, but that's not stealing thunder. That's just sort of giving up and throwing yourself at the mercy of the court. So E does not involve actually revealing a weakness. It's just going, hey, my client's guilty, but give him 4 years instead of, 20. Ugh. Sorry, that just brought up a bad taste in my mouth from recent news. And B, pointing out to jurors during opening statements the mistaken reasoning. That's just good advocacy. That's not volunteering your own weakness. That's attacking the opponent. C is responding by conceding that this is true. That is not bringing it up before the opponent. But as Ida and Mika both grabbed correctly, right? Disclosing in our opening statements that our client has in the past committed plagiarism, that is definitely volunteering a negative fact in the hopes that controlling it is better than letting the opposing side do it. And then A is obviously wrong as well. That's like literally just attacking the other side again. It's not has anything to do with your own client's case. Yeah. So I know that this was a relatively easy version of this sort of question, but application questions tend to be one of the hardest question types on Reading Comp. A lot of five-star application questions. So when you're running into those, especially if you're running into them later in the question set, it is valuable to refresh yourself on the situation first and then jump in. Okay, now we actually have a detail-oriented question, right? This is something the author specifically said in the passage somewhere, right? So we could approach this in a couple of ways. The first is I feel confident that my notes are pretty strong here and that I captured the list well. So volunteering damaging info can make you more credible. Alerting jurors to the opposing side's views can make them more resistant to the framing of the opposing side. It can also make the info less scarce, and therefore people tune it out more to some degree. Um, and then finally, right, we have this idea it can only work when the negative can be spun. So let's jump back over and we just think about those. Hmm. None of those are showing up explicitly, right? So now a second line strategy comes into play because we should always have multiple ways of attacking the same thing. Now I would go through and mark off the ones that I just have no recollection of, right? Things that seem very outside the scope of what we talked about. So, like E, screening prospective jurors, I'm certain that that does contribute to the success in the real world, but I have no recollection at all of this idea, screening jurors during voir dire, coming up in this essay. Okay, D sounds relatively familiar, right? Want to arrive at a firm view regarding the case they're hearing. I'll keep that. Now, client testimony, I don't think that ever came up as well, right? I have no recollection of this ever talking about stealing thunder should be informed by how good your client will be on the stand when they testify about their past decisions. Never saw anything like that. I don't remember B specifically, but it does feel somewhat within scope, right? Some lawyer's superior skill. So I'll hold on to it. And then A, careful timing by only a short time. Again, maybe that could have shown up. So I'll hold it around. All right. Now I might move to another strategy, which is the search box strategy. Search boxing is most useful for locate detail questions. Mega. And it is most useful for these sort of questions. Unfortunately, we're missing some of the things we would most like to have, right? We don't have any proper nouns. Proper nouns cannot be synonymized into another word. They're a proper noun. So proper nouns are great for word searching, right? Makes it very, very easy because there's no risk that the test makers have used a close synonym instead of that word. But here we don't have that. I do see a word like success, and so I could type that in, and I see, no, I have suggest, but not success, right? Um, I might look at careful timing. Testimony, if it included a hostile testimony, sometimes not seeing timing. And then I might go to B and I see, oh, well, B and D share a word, jurors. Oh, now that's helpful. Jurors, who often initially have little information in case, are usually eager to solidify their position. Look at what they did. Look at that. Same sentence, completely different words, right? Juror was the one word they couldn't really change. And I guess case, but if I typed in case, that probably would have come up with a lot of tags. So, proper nouns, distinctive words from the question stem itself, and then words that are shared between answer choices are all good ideas. Jurors is also a word that can't really be synonymized to. The only other thing they could do is jury. But there's not really another word in the English language that means jury other than jury. And there's not really another word in the English language that means juror other than juror. And so that was a really helpful word to search for because they couldn't hide it the way they did eager to solidify, desire to arrive at a firm view. That's really tactical by them. Really, really tactical. Mhm. So again, this gives you that idea of the test makers are thinking about how to make this difficult, right? The way this answer is written clearly evidences their attempt to make it hard to match these two sentences up easily. It's a good little lesson on how they build the RC section. Okay, so now we have a local usage one, right? We have this very specific wording, cognitive framework, and this asks, why did the author use that? Right? Why did the author bring up jurors creating a cognitive framework for jurors? Well, I want to go read context. Jurors are usually eager to solidify their position. They can be expected to use the early positive framing to guide their subsequent analysis. This also suggests limitations. If the info is very damaging, this could form a early negative impression that creates a negative cognitive framework, who then filters subsequent info. So I am clearly looking for the idea of a mindset that can get established early in a trial and kind of drive the jury's decision making and perceptions for the remainder of the trial. So I'll take a second. Want to, if you all want to volunteer something, go ahead and do that in chat. Mm, absolutely. Absolutely. A feels perfect here, right? They want to tell us that early info can really influence subsequent perception and analysis. We'll just run through the others and talk about why they're wrong, right? B is focusing on bringing things into the trial, but this is about creating something at the beginning. Um, This is C feels tempting, right? It's at least in the topic area. And it wouldn't surprise me if C is the second most chosen answer here, right? Because this concept is sort of the idea behind stealing thunder, but it's not what the author is saying here, right? D again is going too far, that stealing thunder is best done as early as possible. No, no, they were saying that you need to be careful because if you give them an early negative impression, that can hurt your own side. And E, just no. For one, the word speculate does not fit this author at all. This is not a speculatory author. This is an incredibly thoughtful academic author. I think that's very obvious. So they are not speculating anything, and they're definitely not speculating that sometimes this is more effective than, A feels perfect. All right. Author's attitude. So here's where that I need to understand the author comes in. Our author seems positive about this in general, but believes that there are limitations to it and that we're not 100% certain that it really does work. Evidence suggests that it does, research suggests that it would be effective, but our author is very hands off, right? So let's look for that vibe in an answer choice. So, first, skeptical. Our author doesn't seem skeptical of anything. They seem thoughtful and doing the research, but skeptical implies a level of like negativity that's absent here. I like D though, approving of its use on the grounds that its success is experimentally supported and can be psychologically explained. That feels good. Concerned that research may omit, no. Favorable towards its use, that sounds good. But the back end of answer choice B feels nonsensical during the open-end statements, but skeptical otherwise. I'm not getting that vibe here. Pause there. Um, for those of you at the 5Cs, if you ever have a chance to take the critical thinking class with Dr. Halpern, strong suggest. One of the points that she makes in her book, Thought and Knowledge, is that humans have a tendency to read the start of sentences and finish them in our head. That is a genuine finding, again, from research literature over and over again. If you feel like you know where the author is going or where an answer is going, a lot of times you don't actually check if it went there. B is that sort of answer choice, right? The front end of this feels perfect, favorable towards its use by lawyers. That is undeniably true, right? The author is favorable. But this back end has literally nothing to do with what the author has said. Here, it's not a very well hidden trap. But in both LR and RC, you will run into this sort of trap and it can be very brutally effective. So just remember to read each and every word of an answer choice, front end and back end, because it is very easy to fall for a good front end when the back end goes wrong. And A, again, so common. Like they didn't even talk about commonality, how many lawyers do this. And I don't think the author was expressing concern that lawyers will screw this up. It's just more, does this seem to work? And boom, there we go, D. I just want to check. Yeah, contraindicated. And let's see, E. I think B is the most chosen otherwise. Yeah. And it's all because of that, right? Like this is just patently absurdist and never mentioned, but a lot of people who are short on time saw the front end of B and clicked yes on it. Yeah. All right. Okay. So now this is again, I think, just a detail question, right? What is the author's characterization based on? And I think we all have this deeply in our head, right? It's psychological research that is relevant but not specifically about stealing thunder and simulated trials. So I'm gonna look for that. I like E. Nope, controlled studies in court. Judges' decisions were never mentioned. No statistical surveys or lawyer observations. No surveys. So there we go. Pretty straightforward. We should know this pretty easily. All right. So now we have a meaning question. So we have this author making a bit of a hedge here, right? Although dot 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 have suggested dot dot dot. So we want to capture that complexity here, right? The author is explaining that there is support, but they're making it clear there's a limitation to the depth of that research thus far. So I'll let y'all take a look for a second and then we'll keep moving. Okay. All right. Agreed completely. Yeah. This one's doing a little bit of a head fake, right? It's giving us a lot of like different concepts, but at the end of the day, effective is defined by does it in fact help lawyers defuse negative facts about their clients' cases? And so A sounds perfect to me too. The technique is in fact effective at getting juries to regard the clients of these lawyers better. Yeah. All right. This is funny, right? Like it feels like this is a very complex question. And then you go, oh, okay, like what is effective? Oh, A, that's what effective means when we talk about stealing thunder. All right. And last one. Now we have a non-author opinion, right? What do lawyers believe? Well, I feel like we just saw that in the previous question when we looked up here. So we know there's at least one belief here. If it's likely to be revealed, it should be volunteered. Otherwise, it would be more damaging. Okay, so take a run. Do we have that answer? And then if we don't, we'll have to go look for other beliefs. But for now, I think we have one that's very clear. Let's look for it. Yeah, yeah, y'all both on point perfectly. Should depend on how likely it is that the opposing side will try to get an advantage. There we go. Well done. Again, people really this one is surprisingly crazy difficult. So 45 percenter. I think a lot of people like go with A, but the problem is that A was the author's opinion. There's no indication down here that this is what lawyers believe, right? It just says this also suggests a limitation. So really, really easy to choose A here, right? Again, I would say this is partially an answer choice order trap, right? But it's always like that. It's really well done, really subtle, really well done. And people who, again, are under time pressure might read A, go, I distinctly remember that being in the passage, hit A and move on, right? But non-author versus author opinion. That actually gives us a good momentary pause. Let me grab this. Where is that from my talk with Patrick? So one of the cool things that has come with AI for the LSAT is I use it for researching test maker tendencies. So very weirdly enough, if you look at 5-star questions for the last 18 tests from the new series, right? E is the correct answer in logical reasoning 26.7% of the time. Kind of shockingly high, honestly. Even more shockingly high is in reading comp, D is the correct answer on a 5-star 30% of the time, or almost 31% of the time. So I bring this up because it hits the answer choice order trap point. When we're doing really tough logical reasoning questions, they like to put the right answer in E because they expect people to read from A down, and that maximizes the likelihood that you'll choose an incorrect answer, right? People will get down before they get to E, they'll establish a favorite and then discount whatever E is saying. You can also see that A is the second most common, and the typical explanation for that is that when you enter your answer choices, you still mulling things over mentally. And so if the right answer is in A, there's a good chance you'll miss it because you haven't completely untangled the question. And so A and E are the two most common answer choices for level fives in LR by far. Um, anyways, just pointing out that there is some very deliberate design happening in the background, right? This does not happen via randomness, especially not with a as intensely designed and tested an exam as the LSAT. All right, so good first passage. We're gonna pop back over here and talk for a second. Um, Author as person. As we get deeper and deeper into the really tough questions of this section, what we're going to see is a lot of inferential type questions that are very hard to answer based solely on the text. Rather, you need to ask yourself, given what I know about the author and their beliefs, right? Given the way they've approached this topic, what can I infer they would also agree with, right? And that's a more amorphous process than just looking for detail info, right? Much, much more amorphous. So, as we work on this exam, we really have to develop our understanding of what authors are doing, how they're doing it, and why. So we just saw a highlight noteworthy that was very academic, right? The author was really genuinely just trying to teach us about what we know about this tactic and what support there is in existence at this moment. That's a pretty straightforward author, right? Even though they're being academic, their intent is very clear throughout this. This entire essay is in their voice, right? It's not written to constantly recount other people's ideas. It's all author thought process and what facts the author thinks we should think about. So we're going to take a look at a much more different type of author. This is one of my favorite passages. This is probably my favorite passage in the history of the exam. Um, what is the name for this one that Patrick gives it? Cooking with Fire, something like that. I've always been a big fan of archaeology and sort of like the genetic lineage of humanity and where we came from and all that sort of stuff. Like evolutionary history really appeals to me. This is a five-star passage with a lot of tough questions because it is very, very hard to read it. Not because it's poorly written, but because it is complex and because the author is hedging, evidencing, pulling back, pushing forward everywhere. So, this is what we would call a challenge position passage. This author wants to prove something, right? They're not teaching us now, they're persuading us. They're marshaling support to convince us of the accuracy of their position. Their academic tone hides that to some degree. It's not so obvious as we might expect, but this is an incredibly aggressive passage in terms of a challenge position. So we'll take a read through, and I would say you can see almost instantly that this is a challenge position. It might have been reasonably expected. It feels a little bit tone right there. I feel like I can hear a little bit of tone from the author already. That the adoption of cooking by early humans would not have led to any changes in human digestive anatomy. After all, cooking makes food easier to eat, which means that no special adaptations are required to process cooked food. However, right, we get our reversal word. Current evidence suggests that humans today are capable of living on raw food only under unusual circumstances. Okay, so I'll turn it over from there for y'all to read the rest. If anybody watching the video, this is PT 84, Section 1, Passage 4. Not sure what it is in the newer series, but I'll scroll in about minute and a half further down. All right. So at the end of the day, the most important thing to take away substantively is that our author is thinking about two ideas, right? Number one, why can't we eat raw food anymore or live off of raw food anymore? And number two, how would cooking have changed us to make that outcome happen? Really fascinating book, by the way. It's from a book called Catching Fire. I know that that's a Hunger Games book, but it is unrelated. Um, and it really, really fascinating deep dive into how cooking and ultimately the social effects of cooking shaped humanity. The author makes a pretty strong argument that our entire, uh, I guess, monogamous husband-wife dynamic comes straight out of cooking and the necessity of cooking for survival. Very, very cool. Um, which is really interesting theory. But let's walk through a few highlights that I made and why I made them, because I want to talk about tactically why am I doing what I'm doing? So you can see I'm grabbing a lot of listing and structural words. After all, however, suggest, right? Conclusory words. Furthermore, contradicting somebody else's potential idea, right? Another sort of suggested conclusion. Principle is an importance word, right? It's emphasizing that this is the important outcome or the most obvious one. We get hedges like also possible and example words like such as. Same thing with include, right? That's giving examples of something. And then again, testing a conclusory word and what ultimately feels like a final conclusion to some degree, which is testing with regards to the raw meat versus cooking idea is warranted, right? So tactical highlighting, never full sentences, just key words that I think structurally tell me where the author is planning to go. All right, this is going to be a tough passage, but let's go ahead and jump in with our main point question. Take your time, put in anything you want, and I'll check back in a minute or two. All right, got one vote for B. All right. Well, I think we can lock that in. And yeah, I do think B is the best answer here. Our author is weighing two ideas, right? Raw versus cooked. They're not necessarily saying they're right. We can see that this author is definitely arguing for their theory, but never asserts that it must be correct. So B hits that tone perfectly, right? Current evidence suggests humans are biologically adapted to ingestion of cooked rather than raw food. We look at the other answers, right? A may be true or not, but it's definitely not the main point. The main point is cooking seems to be why we can't eat raw exclusively. That's a detail that is true but was mentioned. That seems like an inference we could take away from the reference over here about earth ovens, but it is not the main point. And E is something the author immediately rebuts, right? And says we don't have to adapt, but we end up adapting because we don't need certain things once we can eat cooked food. Like big, big, big teeth. We don't need as much anymore. All right. Author agreement. So this is what we would call, or at least I would call, an untargeted prompt, right? Some inference questions give you specificity, right? Would agree about which of the following statements about cooking technology, right? They give you a little more specificity about the topic. Whereas this sort of prompt can refer to anything in the passage. Definitely makes it a little more difficult. Okay, we're in this author agreement, which means that it's not specifically stated, right? None of these answers is specifically in the passage. Otherwise, it would be a detail question and the stem would be different. So we have to think about the takeaways that the author can give us from what we've learned so far. So I'll pause again and take a little thought. I like that here too, Mega. Yeah, the author brings this up at the beginning of the second paragraph, right? And they don't necessarily say this explicitly, but the way they phrase this, important questions arise about the limiting humans to utilize raw food. And then they immediately talk about tooth and jaw size reduction, right? So they don't say specifically that it is the cause, but by proximity and inference, I think A is the best answer. Yeah. All right. Why mention earth ovens? So again, this is a purpose question, which means we need to think about the context above and below. Okay. Yeah. Just it seems to be like it's a part of a rebuttal, right? That's the whole point of the parenthetical. It follows this idea that this widespread assumption appears to be wrong. Okay. Okay. Yeah. A, too specific. Required for a behavior? No, no. C, no, it's not pinpointing the time. D, no, it's not undercutting this. The whole author is trying to argue this. And E, no, right? They do bring up earth ovens, but it's not because they're like dialing in on what sort of things we used. Yeah, this is providing a time frame for judging everything else. All right, we have another author agreement. I'll just kind of walk through this one. So, healthier. I don't think that that's what the author has said. The author definitely thinks that we don't seem to be able to actually live on raw food alone. So I don't know about healthier. I can also tell you from reading the book that one of the author's main points is that vegans and vegetarians tend to have health problems, because it's hard to live off of raw food. So not A. B, humans would not be able to utilize the diet if they had not biologically adapted to it. No. Our author brings up this idea that because cooking makes food easier, there's no special adaptations required. And the author never disagrees with that idea either, right? The author rebuts the idea that we couldn't possibly have changed as a result. But the author definitely doesn't hit back at the idea that cooking doesn't require adaptations. It doesn't. But we adapted to it anyways because that made us more efficient. C is interesting. Feels like something that could be in the passage, but I don't remember it specifically. So I'll just kind of hold C. D is definitely contraindicated, right? For one, like 250,000 years ago, humans did not live sedentary lives. So I don't think D. Now, E, look at that tone. I love that. That feels like this author, right? This author, they are not, they are a really genuinely academic, right? They are not committing to anything. They are just trying to make an argument by pointing out what we already know. E feels perfect, does not yet definitively show. And for those of you that have worked on inference questions in LR, this should be a familiar feeling, right? We want to match the intensity of the original prompt. All right, structure. Structure questions are another one where notes are really, really helpful, right? If you have good notes about a passage, then that usually helps you like develop a very clear sense of what each paragraph is doing. So I'll give you all a second. What is the first paragraph doing? What is the second paragraph doing? What is the third paragraph doing? So take 30 seconds to just think about that and pre-phrase something on your own. And then if you want to jump in and suggest an answer, go for it. So a good thing to remember, we kind of saw this in the main point answer. Um, the last passage and this one is accurate is much, much more important than precise, right? Something that is true but not very descriptive will always triumph over something that is descriptive but inaccurate in any meaningful way. So we are looking for the answer here that is not wrong. That's the best way to put it, right? Not the answer that is perfectly describing these things, but the answer that does not describe them incorrectly. So I think about an answer choice like A, for example, and I get like, okay, maybe we could say that there's a scientific hypothesis. The two predictions, it's unclear to me necessarily what those are, right? Maybe this one is one, selection for such efficiency led to an inability to live on raw food diets. And maybe I could interpret the second paragraph as being an empirical confirmation. I don't really like it as a description, but I could see how maybe it's accurate. But when I get to this third part, describes the empirical disconfirmation of the second prediction. The whole point of the third paragraph is we don't know, right? We need more testing because it's hard to tell if this is high raw meat or high caloric density that drove these changes. So A feels good, but then that third piece, utterly incorrect, can't be correct. I look at B, third paragraph describes an empirical test to show. No, the author says that testing is warranted. They never describe what sort of test they think would be the most appropriate or the most effective. I look at C. Okay, I could get behind argues for a claim. Yeah, the author is arguing for this claim. Could I say that the second paragraph explores a possible objection? Yeah, right. It's trying to address how humans have potentially adapted to cooking and how that as a result prevents us from doing eating raw food exclusively. But again, the third paragraph responds to that objection. No, third paragraph is totally different from the second. We move from teeth and jaw to digestive system. D, no, no, empirical predictions. This is all past looking, right? Everything about both of these paragraphs is past looking, except for the final statement that more testing is warranted. But yeah, E isn't wrong. That's the way we could put it. Do these two paragraphs explore implications of this claim in the first paragraph? Yeah, I would say that is true. I'm dumbing that down. So the way I would just put it is the trick with these structure questions is to not be wrong. Right? It literally is look for an answer that doesn't do anything wrong as opposed to look for an answer that feels like it fits perfectly. Yeah. All right, a strengthen. So we're dealing with that parenthetical again here, and we're asking which, if true, would support this claim that cooking could not have had any impact on biological evolution because its practice appears too recent, is wrong. So again, we kind of want to think about what exactly are we trying to strengthen here, and what sort of evidence would strengthen it. So I note that this is too recent, could not have any impact on biological evolution because it is too recent. If I look at this parenthetical, it definitely hits the recency idea hard, right? The author is very clearly showing that cooking is not that recent, right? We have evidence of up to 250,000 years ago. But what did the author not prove with this little parenthetical? Still doesn't prove that it could have an impact on biological evolution within that time frame, right? It tells us that the time frame is gigantic, in fact, but it doesn't actually lead us to the conclusion that we could evolve within that time period because of fire. So, if I think abstractly about how I would want to strengthen this, I would want to show that humans can biologically evolve within this time period. That would be my goal. I want to get more strength to the biological evolution idea. So I look at these answers and I go, E, hominid species started growing after tooth and jaw size started decreasing. That's still not really telling me how fast that happens. It just says that they started growing. Not quite there. Maybe like if there wasn't a better answer here, I might like E, but I don't think E is really getting us where we need to go. Um, plant foods, I don't know why that would matter. Fire use coincided with ice ages. Again, I don't know why that would matter to the issue at hand, but absolutely, Mega, B is our best answer here. Right? If we can adapt to milk in 5,000 years, we can certainly adapt to cooking in 250,000 years. Yeah. Be surprised, 36%. This is a really tough question for a lot of people. The reason it's a tough question, and the reason it probably didn't feel so tough doing this with me, is because I told you to think about it. A lot of people jump into these strengthen questions without, like, they treat it like it's almost like a detail retrieval question, but no, these are hard. Strengthen in RC tends to be a very hard question type. And we need to think about what we're strengthening and how we could strengthen it. So I thought about what was the claim. I thought about what existing evidence did the author provide, and then I thought what would be a good complement to that evidence. And from that perspective, B becomes the obvious answer. So let's just look. 14% chose A, which is a bit goofy. Like, why does butchering animals with stone tools tell us anything? Um, we have C. Again, I'm not sure what ice ages have to do. Why are those his favorites? Is that a reference? And E. You can see that people just kind of like didn't know what the heck to do on this question. It's not even that there was one good trap answer. It's that people really struggled to figure out what the heck they even needed to be doing. That's the way I would put it. So, strengthen an RC. Approach it the way you would have strengthened an LR. Understand the argument, understand the existing evidence, and think about what other evidence would slot in well. Oh. So now we have a more specific type of question stem, right? Still a detail retrieval one, but they tell us exactly where to look. So I look through these. No, the author explicitly says there was an earlier one with Homo gaster. Adapting to cook food, limited the ability to live on a high meat diet. Um, I think that is definitely something they said. I'm wondering if that was up here or below, but I'm going to keep it. That is third paragraph. I know that for sure. I'll hold on to D because they definitely have talked about cooking methods before. And E, no, this is contradicted, right? It says that the timing of dental reduction is explicable by the regional variation in when improvements in cooking technology were adopted. And now I just answered the question myself. It's D, right? So that's the great thing about these more targeted ones. You can kind of just like in the process of disconfirming one answer, you can confirm another answer. All right, last question. Primary purpose. So let me give you again this idea of I understand the author. Describe implies that the author is not persuading us of anything. A is out. Identify a misconception sounds like the author is trying to educate us about something. Again, persuasive. Elucidate the meaning of a scientific hypothesis. I'll hold it. Propose a scientific hypothesis. I like that even more. Undermine the support for a scientific principle. No, no. Maybe we could say the author's undermining the idea that humans could live on raw food, but nobody actually ever made that claim. It's just the author like brings up the idea as part of, I think, working towards the cooking angle. And then I go, okay, was my author trying to be persuasive? Yeah. Elucidate is explain, right? Elaborate. Propose. Now that is a persuasive author description. And so I choose D here. Again, this is a 5-star question, 55% correct answer rate. But from my perspective, at least, none of the other answers make any sense given the tone of this author. You know, I think E is actually like the best one otherwise, but that principal idea is definitely weird. What did else describe a scientific puzzle? Yeah, surprising to me, right? So knowing what your author is attempting to do and knowing how your author has been attempting to do that makes a very difficult 5-star like this, in my opinion, quite trivial. All right. So I'll pause there. Do any of y'all have any questions? Just stuff you want to discuss momentarily? Oh, we're not gonna have enough time for Noguchi or the other ones. Okay. So we'll just kind of round out with the idea of what to do next when you're studying reading comp. So first and foremost, I think understanding the types of essays we run into is important. Those frameworks. A lot of what I taught today was informed by frameworks and how we can use them aggressively and offensively to like really figure out author intent questions. Um, LSAT Lab has a frameworks approach. I know that Seven Sage just revamped their curriculum for RC into a similar approach. And I know RC Hero is like kind of the first person maybe that was really pushing the idea of frameworks or conceptually. So I think that is a very valuable piece of curriculum. And I do not think that an RC curriculum that focuses solely on question types and like basic note-taking strategies is a good curriculum. Second thing is to force yourself to engage with the author and not the text, right? The text reveals the author. The text itself is 1/3 of the RC section, the other 2/3 is the author themselves. So you need to learn how to use content to inform understanding of the actual person behind the veil. Um, Finally, once you've gotten a good handle on question types and frameworks, you should really work on a retention strategy. You saw a little bit of my notes today, and you can see how my notes tend to be very similar looking to each other, very sleek, 1 to 3 lines per paragraph, almost always in shorthand, right? Oh, here's the one we just did. Why do humans need cooked food? Because plant low digest, raw meat tough to eat, cooking not too recent, 250K ovens, need high caloric density from cooking. Cooking led to jaw and tooth size down. Cooking regionally correlated with size reduction in tooth and jaw. Homo erectus had a reduction, or Gaster, I think, reduction 1.9 million years ago. Digestive anatomy is hard to study because there's no fossils. Cooking versus high raw meat is unclear. Same adaptations need more testing. That's a pretty good set of notes for those, I think. So, minimalist, right? I am trying to grab what I think are the most important things the author has said. And what I'm really trying to grab is what is the author's thread, right? This is the author's thread. When we talk about like through lines in writing, that's really what I'm looking for most is what is the information most relevant to the author's through line? Um, yeah. So step one, understand the types of essays that we run into and the types of goals those authors have. Step two, start doing lots of practice passages, right? Work on practice passages, understand the question types and how to approach them. Standard test prep curriculum tends to be quite good for test prep or question type approaches. So use your standard test prep for that. It'll give you a great base to start with, right? Number three, work on a note-taking or memory retention method. Either you need to have an active reading strategy, right? Or you need to be note-taking. I think those are really, one or the other is essential to doing well on this section. One thing I often suggest to students is that early on, as soon as they finish the first paragraph of a passage, they write down what they think the framework is. They write down whether the author is persuasive or educational, and they write down what they think the author's position is. And then when they finish reading the passage, they do those same 3 things again before jumping into questions. I have found that that sort of routine practice is very, very, very successful and helpful, right? You're not going to do it on test day, but you're training your brain to ask that question automatically as you read.
Mm.
Um, all right. So I think we'll call it a day right now. I will have the newest videos up and online by tomorrow morning, and I'll shoot out an email as usual to let you all know that they are up. And in 2 weeks, are y'all still on break in 2 weeks?
No, we should not be on break.
Okay, all right. So we'll still have a standard
Yeah.
session then. Okay,
Our break is
excellent.
kind of the week in between. So during our off week.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. That'll make it even easier then. All right.
Yeah.
So we will do I'm not 100% certain what we're gonna do that day. So
Okay.
I'll shoot you an email, or I'll shoot you all an email and just kind of update you on it.
Yeah. Feel free to take some time to figure it out.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for coming as usual. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for hosting it. This was really informative. I have a lot of dense notes on how to approach reading comprehension now.
Good. Excellent. All right. Well, yeah, thanks to everybody watching. Thank you, Gita. Thank you, Mika.
Thank you.
And
Yeah.
bye, everyone.
Bye bye.